Discrimination Commissioner, and I've been in that role for about 4 or 5 months, so it's beyond the honeymoon period. And previously, I was the New South Wales Ageing Disability Commissioner for 5 years. So it's great to be with you on what I understand is the end of 2 terrific days. And as I was looking at the program and thinking about it, the song by Helen Reddy, years and years ago, I Am Woman, came to mind. And one of the things in that was a lovely verse, which I think reflects many of the discussions you would have had over the last couple of days. It said, yes, I am wise, but it's wisdom born of pain. Yes, I paid the price, but look at how much I've gained. And for older women, I think that's a story that actually rings true. And I'm sure in the symposium you've shared the experiences, the good and the bad. I'm sure you've absolutely shared your knowledge and expertise, which abounds in this sector. But most importantly, you've shared those passions. And passionate about being old is something that we really need a great deal of. One of the things we always talk about for older people is, the loss of presence, the invisibility that occurs. And as I always say, that's much worse if you also lose your voice. And the one thing I'm absolutely certain of in this symposium is your voice and presence were well felt, and it needs to be. But in society, it is a bit of a challenge, and I suppose I just want to reflect on a couple of things. The first is there is a convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. And the question for me is really, is that sufficient? In many senses, that particular declaration made a huge difference. But for older women, perhaps it doesn't speak strongly enough for their needs and their aspirations. And as you know, I'm a very strong believer that Australia should adopt a strong positive position in relation to supporting the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Older People. And I think the combination of those two conventions really would give voice and presence to older women in a way that perhaps we haven't had and don't have right at the moment. Of course, sitting behind all of that is ageism. In the last couple of weeks, there's been a whole lot of talk about ageism. Ageism is the way in which we think, we feel, and we act towards others. And discrimination, of course, is when it's actually about decisions that disadvantage people simply based on nothing else other than age. But ageism does sit behind so much of what you've been talking about. One of the things I'm very clear about, and you've articulated in your life stages approach, is the journey to aging is as important as the journey through aging. And so one of the challenges for us is not only to look at policies that directly affect older people, but to look at those policies that affect particularly women in their 30s and their 40s and their 50s as they move towards an older age or an older state of living. And we see that in terms of the financial barriers and burdens that are put in place. We see that in the inequalities that happen with employment, particularly for women over the age of 55. We see it in the areas of domestic violence and family abuse that you've been talking about so much. And frankly, we just see it in the area of power imbalance. As a man born, a white man born in 1955, I have that privilege. Nobody ever denies to me the right to have a say, to be present in the decisions that make them. Yet I'm acutely aware that is not true for women, and I'm acutely aware that's not true for a very big percentage of our population, First Nations and culturally diverse communities. And so in many senses, it is rights that actually level the playing field for all of us. It's not about just services, it's not about systems, it is actually about rights. The journey through aging is also within a context. 2 days ago, I launched a report called Shaping Perspectives, the way in which media reports on aging. And this was a report that was actually from inside the media. That is, it was a report about the views of journalists, of editors, of communication consultants. And of course, they identified that whilst they do in fact have many good stories about older people, the truth was that mostly it was negative. Some of those you understand well. The framing of aging is a problem, as though it's something to be cured. Prevailing narrative of decline and frailty and vulnerability. One of the emerging issues is this intergenerational sort of tension or conflict between young people and older people, and the fair sharing of resources or the failure to do so. And of course, one of the most significant findings by the journalists themselves was gender ageism. And they recognised that this is a focus on perceived tensions with older women, particularly around the way they look, the aesthetics of growing old. And they identified that as a significant issue as well. But the journey through ageing is a complex journey. It's a journey that is about employment, the right of women, older women, to be able to stay in the workforce. Mature age workers are defined as 45 years of age, of all things, far too young. But as I said before, in employment, the rubber really hits the road for women over 55. But the right to be employed for older people generally is really important. The issue about elder abuse, which you've been talking about, is a complex story. It is a gendered story. Last year at the Commission, which I headed up, the Ageing Disability Commission in New South Wales, 65% of all reports are in relation to older women. That leaves a sizable number of men as well. But there is a gender story to be told. But it's a complex story because the nature of the abuse is represented differently in terms of its impact on women. So, for example, sexual abuse and physical abuse is largely for women. Neglect is actually much more evenly spread. And financial abuse, where it is still the case that most abuse is about women, in terms of perpetrators, it's very interesting. You're as likely to be abused as an older woman by your daughter as you are by your son. And that's an unusual story to tell because generally abuse is easily defined as being the majority of perpetrators are men. So it's a complex story, but our responses to it have to have a gender lens. We have to be able to look at the way in which we both prevent and respond to elder abuse through the lens of gender, both male and female. And you've been identifying through this symposium various ways and experiences. What we know is that the story is not the same. The abuse might be the same, but the way in which that's occurred, the risks, the vulnerabilities are different. And importantly, so too are the responses between men and women, depending on the nature of the abuse and the age as we go forward. And finally, we need service systems that actually represent the views and voices of older people generally, and in particular women. In Australia, most public policy is decided by middle-aged, middle-class men, and now women, for middle-class, middle-aged men and women. And that's not the world in which you live, and it's not the world in which I live. As a consequence of that, the true voice of older people is missing. The true voice of vulnerable women is often missing. The voice of First Nations women and the voice of culturally diverse communities and the women within them is missing. And if you live in Sydney and Melbourne, you know that that's not the world we live in. It's very diverse. So we need to be very appreciative of what are the views of women from those different backgrounds. I just had a revelation, I suppose, recently, was that I've been about how do you gain access to those communities? How do you talk about elder abuse to First Nations people, to people in culturally different communities, where the whole notion of abuse of elderly people is an anathema? And that's what we've got to do. But what about actually listening to the way in which those communities treat women? How are older women treated in those communities? Sure, there are the stories of poor treatment, but there's also the cultural difference where older people are actually valued. And so maybe we have something to learn from those communities, rather than just wanting to find out how we can be part of their community, offering services and responses. And I'm sure you've discussed that. So as we go forward, I think your voice, I don't think I need to tell you how to unsilence older women. I think you've been doing that for the last 2 days. But we do need to make sure that all older people, including women, and especially women who are vulnerable, are in fact not mere onlookers in their own lives. Older people are not onlookers in the decisions that affect them. Older people should not be onlookers in the systems and the support services that are provided to them. They absolutely should not be onlookers in the society in which they live. But of course, the quality of that engagement in that society does depend on all of those issues from when you were a young person right through. And that's what your conference has been about. So I, as an Age Discrimination Commissioner, are at one with you that I think we do need to have a much deeper and richer conversation. Older people are not homogenous. There are differences between men and women, and there are certainly differences between those of us that are economically well off and those of us that struggle on a daily basis simply to survive. the conditions we have and the frailties that develop and the people around us all make for a very complex but rich life. Finally, I think the way to see ageing is really through the lens of an ageing potential. And when we've been talking to the media this week, it's about that. Can't we have a narrative that recognises the great challenges, but also unleashes the potential of older people in society generally? I know Deborah, I think, is going to talk about this lovely concept of joyful rage. When I was president of ACOS, there was a caricature of me in the Australian Financial Review, and the byline was the angry angel. Well, I reckon a bit of rage and a bit of anger goes a long way. But at the end of the day, I think we're simply talking about being passionate about the cause. So I'm passionate with you, not only for all older people, but especially to recognise the needs of women and gender generally in all of its forms, transgender and other issues that you've been discussing. So I join with you in breaking the silence for older women, and hopefully together we can shape a prosperous, or at least a better future for all of us as we age. Thank you very much.
Robert, thank you so much. Your words bring hope to so many of us. You have a great intellect, wonderful compassion for other people, and there's a fabulous humanness and your commitment to the rights of older people. I think they are the attributes that give so many of us hope for the future. Your leadership is greatly valued, and I don't say that lightly at all. So thank you.